All right, in this next brief video, I want to spend some time talking about, introduce the topic of hematopoiesis, and then talk a little more specifically about a process called erythropoiesis, or the production of red blood cells. Okay, so hematopoiesis, remember hemat, hemato is blood, all right, and then poiesis means to produce. Okay, so in general, when we say hematopoiesis, what we're talking about is producing blood. More specifically, the production of blood cells. Okay, I mean, plasma, the watery component of our blood, primarily just comes from, how much water intake that we have in our body. So that's basically, regulated through water consumption, whereas blood cells are regulated through various processes. Okay, and remember that the process of hematopoiesis occurs in red bone marrow. Now, don't get in the habit of saying bone marrow. And I see a lot of students do this. They want to say, blood cells are produced in bone marrow. You're not 100% wrong by saying that, but it is. Remember, there are two types of bone marrow. There's yellow and red bone marrow, and yellow bone marrow is just basically fat that just fills up space in the shafts or the diaphysis of long bones. Okay, so it's the red bone marrow that takes part in this. And red bone marrow is kind of similar to blood. Remember we said that the composition of blood is about 55% plasma, 45% formed elements. Okay, whereas bone marrow is about, give or take, 85 to 90% formed elements and very little plasma. Okay, so the remaining would be, the watery component. So basically, red bone marrow is just really thick blood, more or less, except the types of cells that you find in red bone marrow are what are called hematopoietic stem cells. Okay, hematopoietic stem cells. All right. Or even more specific than that, pluripotent. Okay, pluripotent stem cells. So PHSCs, they're called PHSCs. Pluripotent. These are stem cells that have a lot of potential for differentiation. Remember, when I say the word differentiate, you should think specialized. Okay, and remember that stem cells are just real basic cells. They've got a plasma membrane, they've got the basic organelles, but they're not really doing anything. Okay, and then when you expose these pluripotent stem cells to the right chemical bath in the right environment, then they differentiate or specialize into a particular cell type. Okay, so basically what we do is we expose these pluripotent stem cells to different forms of chemical messages, and then they differentiate into, so basically then they start to, through a step-by-step process of cell divisions, they become, they start to form the precursors of a red blood cell. Okay, or they'll start to form into the precursors of a white blood cell. Okay, or they may start to form into the precursors of a thrombocyte. Okay, the cells that, megakaryocytes that produce platelets. Okay, but that's essentially how this process works. All right. Now, when it comes to blood cell production throughout life, we start producing blood in the yolk sac within the first trimester. So basically, we start at, the early part of our life. We kind of look like so. All right, then we've got this big sac that we call the yolk sac. Okay, and then within the yolk sac, that's where blood cell formation begins. Okay, and then as our organs develop and we work our way into the second trimester, then that's when the liver and the spleen take over. All right. And then the liver and the spleen become basically, for most of, the middle part of embryonic development, become the organs that manufacture RBCs, all right, or blood cells in general. And then as you progress into the third trimester and organs and bones become more mature, then that's when the red bone marrow takes over. Okay, and then then after birth, for the rest of our life, the red bone marrow is where we manufacture blood cells from there on out. Okay, so that's hematopoiesis. All right, now let's get into a more specific process, erythropoiesis. All right, so erythropoiesis is the production of erythrocytes, or red blood cells. Okay, remember erythrocyte means RBC, red blood cell. All right, and this is a process that's essentially regulated by the production and destruction of in combination of the production and destruction of red blood cells, and also by the blood oxygen levels of the body. Okay. Now remember, just a review, that red blood cells, their average lifespan is about 120 days. Okay, and remember your basic morphologic characteristics of a red blood cell, that they don't have a nucleus, so they're enucleated. Okay, they don't have organelles. Okay, all they really have is a cytoskeleton. Okay, the cytoplasm is packed with hemoglobin, and there are some enzymes that allow the cells to, some metabolically active enzymes within the red blood cell that allow it to, have some sort of a metabolism, produce some ATP, metabolize glucose, and utilize energy to make their cytoskeleton a little flexible. Okay, so they can squeeze through the narrow parts of our circulation. But remember, without these organelles, okay, without a nucleus and other organelles, these are incapable of mitosis, and they're incapable of manufacturing proteins. Okay, and you remember, always keep this in the back of your mind, that the average diameter of a red blood cell is about 7.5 micrometers. Okay, and capillaries are not that much larger. Okay, capillaries on average are 8 to 8.5 micrometers, and there are some that are even smaller than that, like the capillaries in the spleen can be as small as 3 micrometers in diameter. And remember, when I say micrometer, I'm talking a thousandth of a millimeter. Okay, so we're talking very, very small here. All right. Now, remember that these cells do have very flexible cytoskeletons, and they can bend and squeeze and contort through these small vessels. But over time, these proteins, between all the bending and contorting they have to do, and the force, the pressure that drives the movement of these blood cells, their cytoskeleton is going to start to break apart. Okay, and then without these organelles, without the nucleus and the other and the rough ER and ribosomes and so on, they're not going to be able to replace those proteins in their cytoskeleton that broke down. And then if they're unable to replace those proteins, the cells themselves are going to break apart, especially when they get pushed through the spleen. Okay, when they get pushed through the spleen, those small capillaries of the spleen, that'll just force these cells to break open. And then phagocytes will basically metabolize these, will consume them, and metabolize the hemoglobin, the iron, and do certain things with it, which I'll talk about in a little while. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's kind of the lifespan of a erythrocyte. All right, and let's talk about how this is controlled a little more. So like we said before, the production of red blood cells is regulated essentially through blood oxygen levels, and at what rate are we going through red blood cells, okay? And when we need to enhance this process, we use hormones to enhance this process. All right, and the main hormone that is involved in this is erythropoietin. I put testosterone down just because testosterone just enhances this process even more. That's why men, I mentioned this in a previous video, that's why males have larger red blood cell counts, because they have a lot more testosterone in their bloodstream than females, and that, again, that stimulates a higher rate of production of erythrocytes. Okay, and then when this process goes awry, all right, if this happens in excess, then we're going to have an increased hematocrit. Okay, we're going to have an increased, our blood's going to become more viscous and more thick, and that's going to affect how it circulates throughout the body and affect blood pressure and so on. Okay, or could cause a process called polycythemia, all right, or a process of disease, I'm sorry. So excessive production means excessive cells. Decreased production means not enough cells. And this is, I don't know why this didn't transfer into this program. It should say O2. All right, but decreased production of erythrocytes is going to cause a drop in our blood oxygen carrying capacity. And then that means we won't be able to deliver oxygen properly and effectively to our tissues that need oxygen. All right. Now, in order for this process to take place, there needs to be some proper nutritional requirements, okay? For starters, there has to be protein. All the cytoskeletons are protein. Hemoglobin is protein, okay? If you want to manufacture proteins, you have to put proteins in you, because remember that we only, out of the 20 amino acids, we only manufacture on our own about 12 of them. The other 8 we have to consume ourselves. All right. And in order to properly absorb amino acids in the GI tract, you have to eat all 20 at once. All 20 have to be present in there. All right. So as a result, that's why the best source of protein is meat, because meat is what's called a complete protein. All right. Meat's a complete protein, meaning it's a food that has all 20 amino acids within it. So you get exposed to all of them. If you're a person who's listening to this and you're a vegetarian, you have to make sure you're eating the right combinations of vegetables in order to get all these amino acids in your system. And that's why a lot of vegetarians, vegetarianism is kind of a bandwagon, kind of a diet that you see a lot of people do. One, just because, people do it for health reasons. They want to lose weight. They think they're going to detoxify their body or whatever reasons they're doing them for. But they don't research or understand how this process works very well. And they think just eating, vegetables is going to do them good, but not eating the right kinds in the right combination with one another, they'll wind up getting sick. They don't have a lot of energy. They just don't feel good. Then they say, okay, forget this. I'm going to go back to the eating meat thing. Or some people go to vegetarianism because they, I don't know, cruelty to animals, or they don't like the fact that the animals are being killed. Well, the animals are going to die anyway. They're just dying sooner. So you're not really supporting a cause by doing that. Then there are some people out there who are actually allergic to some products that are in meat, and who are very limited in the amount of meat they can eat. And if you're one of those people, again, make sure that you eat the right combinations, like certain rices and beans and things like that, aside from just fruits and vegetables. Okay. So you need to have enough protein. Adequate iron intake. Okay, adequate iron. You need to make sure that you've got enough iron in your system. You're still going to make red blood cells if you don't have iron. But remember, when we learned about hemoglobin a little while ago, hemoglobin is a conjugated protein, right? It's a quaternary protein. It's 2 alpha 2 beta units that are glued together, and the central part of each hemoglobin molecule, each protein, is going to have what's called a heme group in the middle. All right, and then that the real functional part of that heme group is the iron. The iron atom that's in there. All right, because it's the iron that now the oxygen does not actually stick to the iron itself. What it does is it actually links to one of the structural bonds of the heme group. Okay, which is good, because that gives it a very loose conformation, which makes it very easy for oxygen to disassociate or detach from this, which is important if we want to deliver oxygen to tissues. Okay, but in a nutshell, you need that iron in order to carry oxygen. So if you don't have enough iron in your diet, then, well, you're not going to synthesize hemoglobin. You're not going to be able to make proper hemoglobin. Okay, and remember that the average male excretes about give or take about I think it was 0.6 milligrams per day. Yeah, 0.6 milligrams per day. Most of it is within the feces. And women, on the other hand, can lose an average about 1.3 milligrams per day. All right. And then the average male should be taking in about 6 milligrams of iron per day, and women about 8 to 10 milligrams per day. Okay. The reason why, a very important reason why you have to consume so much is because this is really difficult to absorb. A lot of the iron you're going to try to actually eat is probably not going to actually make it into your system. Okay. But in the end, this is about the adequate iron intake to match the average person's loss. Now, this is going to vary with age and where you're at, depending on your age and gender, but those are about the average values for an adult. Okay, so in order to make proper hemoglobin, you need the iron, and then you need adequate vitamin intake as well. The vitamins you especially need are vitamin B12 and folic acid. Okay, both of these are utilized by cells that divide at very rapid rates. Okay, they're both used by cells that divide at very rapid rates. I mean, folic acid and B12 are not only important for this process, but many other cells that that divide at high rates. For example, they're also important for the production of DNA as well. Okay. Now, so if you're deficient in vitamin B, B12 and or folic acid, then you'll still be able to manufacture red blood cells, but not at the rate you need to, and then you're going to wind up producing these abnormal red blood cells as well. Okay, and then you'll start releasing those out into the circulation, and then you'll develop a specific type of anemia. All right, specific type of anemia called pernicious anemia, where the red blood cells actually have a nucleus that you're looking at. All right. Now, one thing about vitamin B12, when it comes to the absorption of these, vitamin B12, the lining of the stomach produces a chemical called intrinsic factor. Okay, intrinsic factor. All right, and then this binds to B12, and then we absorb it in the small intestine. All right, now if a person has stomach problems, if they've had stomach cancer, if they've had ulcerations all over their stomach, if they've had some other kind of issue with the lining of with the epithelial lining of the stomach, then they're going to have a hard time, getting intrinsic factor. Or people that have had, gastric resections, people that have part of their stomach cut out for the purpose of losing weight. All right, then chances are you more than likely are going to cut out a lot of the cells that have to produce B12, or some people have to have a complete stomach removal in certain situations, and then they have no source of intrinsic factor, and then getting B12 in their system is going to be different. All right. So make sure that if you are a person that wants to have a procedure done for weight loss purposes with their stomach, really warn them about the consequences of that, and just stick with the good old-fashioned way of doing it. But so these are the nutritional requirements to make this process happen. Now, like I said before, one of the biggest regulators of this process is the blood oxygen levels. All right, so there are certain scenarios where your blood oxygen levels could go down. For example, if you go to high altitude. Okay, if you've got a COPD, a lung disorder. If you exercise. Okay, these are all modalities or causes that could increase your red blood cell count to go up. Okay, so essentially what happens with this process is, so let's say we've got a drop in blood O2 levels for whatever reason, whether you go to higher altitude where there's just less available oxygen in the air, you've got a lung disorder where you have a hard time getting oxygen in your system, or where you constantly exercise and you burn through so much oxygen, you need to have more red blood cells to utilize oxygen properly. All right, so then now what's going to happen is your blood oxygen levels drop. There's a specific hormone that is secreted called EPO, or erythropoietin, erythropoietin. Okay, and this hormone is secreted from the kidneys. The kidneys are highly sensitive to this drop in blood oxygen levels, and it's not well understood exactly where from the kidneys that this hormone is secreted. I've read on this, and a lot of people believe that this hormone is secreted from the tubular lining of the nephrons somewhere within the kidneys, just because they're very metabolically demanding with all the pumping actions that are going on between the bloodstream and tubular fluid. But again, it's not well understood. Okay, so then EPO, what it does is EPO, obviously the target tissue for erythropoietin is going to be the red marrow. All right, the target tissue for that will be the red marrow. All right, now, erythropoietin is very important because, erythropoietin is not the only chemical message that's involved with making red blood cells. EPO and a chemical message called a colony forming unit, okay, are very important for, colony forming units are, chemical messages that are within bone marrow that really stimulate the process of the production of cells. And there are specific ones. So this would be CFUE, colony forming unit, erythrocyte. All right, but then when you get erythropoietin and CFUE together, then that essentially more or less really turns this process up. Think of it as more or less activating the process, and then we go through the step-by-step process of erythropoiesis. All right, so then we'll crank out more red blood cells. All right, and then what'll happen is now we'll have an increased RBC count. And then what's going to happen to erythropoietin? Obviously, the secretion of erythropoietin is going to go down once our red blood cell count goes up and we're able to utilize oxygen better. So obviously, this is an example of negative feedback. Okay, negative feedback. Now, erythropoietin is not only a hormone that we just naturally crank out for these particular reasons, but it's also a hormone that's used medically. For example, people that are cancer patients, people that are undergoing chemotherapy. Bear in mind that chemotherapy is a treatment for people who have metastatic or malignant cancers. And remember that these are cells that divide and grow at very rapid rates. Now, chemotherapy, bear in mind there are different types of chemo, but chemo is a lot more of a general type of a treatment. It targets cells that divide at a rapid rate. And our own cells that also do this fall victim to this process. That's why, when people undergo chemo, you see a lot of the similar side effects of it. The hair loss, the loss of appetite, the drop in bone density, and also a drop in our blood cell count, especially red blood cells. All right. So then, basically, once they're, then you start giving these patients EPO to try to enhance the red blood cell production of themselves. Okay, athletes love EPO. Professional athletes love erythropoietin. Especially athletes that do, endurance sports like cycling, swimming, running, because if you produce more red blood cells, well, you're going to be able to utilize oxygen more efficiently. All right, but then the problem is some of these people overdo it and they take too much erythropoietin, and then then what happens? Their hematocrit gets too high, their blood gets too thick, and then it's more like pumping sludge through their veins than it is, like pumping a gel like blood through their veins, and then they have to get off the EPO, obviously, or else they'll possibly kill themselves. Most of the time they'll have to be hospitalized, but some athletes have to learn things really the hard way. Another reason why athletes like EPO so much is basically, when you take it, it's basically cleared out in about 24 hours. So it's in and out pretty quick. All right. So that's essentially how this process is regulated. And as I mentioned before, the average lifespan of a erythrocyte is about 120 days. Okay, and once it gets to the spleen, it's going to get disposed of in there. And remember before I said that the capillaries of the spleen are about 3 micrometers in diameter, and there's a specific type of tissue in the spleen called red pulp. Okay, where we have a lot of the major vessels and capillaries within the spleen. They're very small, and like I said, as the erythrocytes squeeze through here, they just burst open. All right. And then as they burst open, there are phagocytes that will consume these leftover products and then digest them down. The hemoglobin is broken down. Okay, the cytoskeleton is broken down. All the enzymes are broken down. Usually some of the iron is metabolized by these and secreted out into the bloodstream. And it's reused. Usually becomes what's called bilirubin, and then combines with other products that are found in bile. That's what gives bile kind of that yellow color. All right, and so that bilirubin gets stored in the liver, and we use it as bile, and then that gets eliminated in fecal matter. Okay. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are some pathologies that are involved with this. And as I mentioned before, people that have that undergo this process in excess, then they will undergo polycythemia, more specifically polycythemia vera. All right, and then what happens here is they have a dramatically increased hematocrit. Okay, dramatically increased hematocrit, which basically increases their viscosity. Okay, which increases resistance to flow. I mean, we have some compensatory mechanisms to deal with this, but if we don't, then this is going to make the blood more thick. It's going to bring blood pressure up. It's just going to be a mess. Okay, and then anemia. There's different types of anemias that can occur. And you remember before I said that, when we produce red blood cells, we go through a process. The first step is the production of what's called a pro-erythroblast. Okay, and then they start to divide and then form into what's called a basophil erythroblast. All right. And then as they keep developing, then they form into polychromatophil erythroblasts. Now, what you notice is they're going to start getting smaller. The nucleus is also going to start getting smaller. So this would be all right. And then as they continue to divide, they form into what are called reticulocytes, which basically there's practically no nucleus, and then there's mainly cytoskeleton. And then these reticulocytes actually get into the peripheral circulation, and then after a couple of days, then they become erythrocytes. Okay, then they become erythrocytes. All right. Now, so a disruption in this process can cause anemia, as I mentioned before. For example, in people with pernicious anemia develop these goofy-looking red blood cells that are called megaloblasts. Okay, megaloblast, and that again comes from a vitamin B12 deficiency. All right, and then without enough vitamin B12 in the system, these cells won't be able to divide properly, and then eventually mature into this version of erythrocyte without a nucleus. And then what will wind up happening is they're going to be these big cells that have a nucleus. They're going to be really goofy looking red blood cells. And remember, one, being big is bad because they have we need these cells to be small so they can squeeze through the microcirculation of the body, and also by having a nucleus, they're not going to have enough room for hemoglobin on themselves to meet our metabolic demands to circulate oxygen. So as a result, these cells are going to be very ineffective, and then our oxygen carrying capacity is going to be too low. Some people have what's called iron deficiency anemia. Okay, people that have iron deficiency anemia eventually are going to when you look at those cells under a microscope, those are going to be what are called hypochromic. Okay, basically they're going to look very pale. All right, they're going to look very pale and transparent because remember, iron, and when you mix iron and hemoglobin together, within that heme group, that's what gives red blood cells that deep red color. Without enough iron, then they're going to be very transparent, pale, pasty-looking cells under the microscope. All right, and again, a diminished oxygen carrying capacity. I talked about sickle cell anemia in another video when I was talking about the structure of hemoglobin. All right, and if that valine is replaced by a glutamic acid, and then the hemoglobin crystallizes and contorts the cell into this goofy shape, that hemoglobin is non-functional. Okay, and then that hemoglobin, if it's not working very well because it's crystallized and hard and abnormally shaped, then you're not going to be able to bind oxygen to it very well. So basically, you're getting the picture with anemia here. I just mentioned a couple different examples of anemia, but the general gist of anemia is a pathology that affects red blood cells and a red blood cell's ability to carry oxygen. Okay, the specific names of anemia are just basically describing the cause of the anemia or the effects of the anemia. Okay, but that's what the general premise behind anemia revolves around, is your red blood cells are not able to do their job, circulate gases normally. Okay, so those are the erythrocytes. In the next video, I will be talking a little more about blood cells, but now I'm kind of done with erythrocytes, and I'm going to jump into leukocytes. Let's see here.